Well, thank you so much, Assembly Member. You let me call you Assembly Member there?
Oh, thank you. Well, I take that as a nice honorific title.
I've also declared war on potholes, so here's the first shot across the bow.
Well, as you know, with Planet Albany, there's always something that makes the planet turn.
And it's this amazing view of D.C., and Eddie Vedder comes out. And he goes, "You have a cigarette?" And I've never smoked in my life, but if I had, I wish that was the moment.
And this strategy takes us from potholes to knotholes.
I would like to say it was a pleasure, Mr. Kim. But I'm on the road.
I'm David Lombardo, and this is Dispatches from Planet Albany, a WCNY podcast about power and politics in state government. On today's episode, we're going to check in with Richard Rifkin, who, back in the 90s, led the state's ethics body and is now the legal director for the Government Law Center at the Albany Law School. We talked with Richard for the Capitol Press Room about the curious ruling in February from the State Court of Appeals that upheld the validity of the Commission on Ethics and Lobbying in Government. We ended up getting into the weeds on the case and then talking about his experience with ethics enforcement, but all that got cut from the radio, so we're sharing it here for Dispatches. First, though, we're going to hear from State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli, who was also on the Capitol Press Room this week, but we ran out of time to discuss his political future, the 2026 gubernatorial election, aging politicians, and his plans, or lack of plans, to oversee the CDPAP transition that's happening now. So all of that conversation is packaged for you right here. Well, sticking with the contracts that your office can review and can't review, in 2024 there was some hullabaloo around the process the state followed to award a multi-billion-dollar contract to PPL, which was tasked with overseeing the CDPAP program. And at the time, it was reported that your office didn't get to review the deal before it was inked. One, is that accurate? And if it is, has your office been subsequently able to review the contract now that it is in effect and PPL is leading this transition?
Well, I mean, it's accurate. We were carved out specifically. It was part of the budget language. So when you're carved out, you're carved out. I mean, there's nothing for us to review. It didn't go through us. There's still a fair amount of controversy. We'll see whether or not in this budget negotiation there'll be any change in the deadline or change of the parameters. Some folks have asked us to do an audit, but the program is still in an evolutionary stage, right? Implementation stage. There's really nothing for us to audit right now.
But since it has been signed, since the contract has been signed, have you gotten a chance to look at it now?
To what end?
Just to let the public become more aware of it, to give your review and say, hey, this was good, or maybe no, this doesn't pass the smell test, and state legislatures, you should revisit this.
What we would do more typically would be an audit of the program when enough time has passed for us to make an evaluation. But if we're cut out of the contract review, there's no reason for us to review the contract, frankly.
And what is the timeline for an audit review? Because for people who aren't familiar, some of your audits will come out and there will be a retrospective, say, a year previous, 2 years previous. How close to real time can some of this work be done?
It's an interesting question. Have you ever asked any of my auditors that question?
No.
I have.
I mean, can you just send somebody over to DOH right now? Hey, we're just going to look over your shoulder while you're doing this.
It depends on the circumstances. Some of the audits, you're absolutely right, take not just months, but sometimes years, depending on the time frame and the complexity. In the reverse, if there's a real emergency situation, can our auditors go in real time? Let's say there's a local government in a crisis. Have we had some more rapid turnaround? Part of it is a reflection of resources. We do hundreds of audits, both on the state side and on the local government side. So, some of it is just a question of resources and timing. But there's no hard and fast time frame. When we announce an audit or we engage an audit, at the very least, it's going to take months and sometimes longer.
When we talk to stakeholders about this issue, they frame this in pretty dire consequences. So when you talk about resources and the ability to do these types of audits, does it make sense to redeploy someone who's looking at, the VLT purses from 2023 or the fiscal stress of a municipality to something that's more immediate like this?
You could, but again, the program is just getting off the ground. So what are you auditing right now?
I guess you'd be looking at the transition process right now and what was done, what you could learn from that.
I think because it's in transition, it would not be a very fertile area for an audit.
Okay. So turning to another ongoing issue, it came out recently that your office has added up the legal fees for former Governor Cuomo, and we're talking about tens of millions of dollars that's been paid out in his various defenses since he left office. And I'm curious, what is the process like now and moving forward for determining what bills to pay? And is there a threshold where you change that calculation, where you say, hey, we're at $100 million, maybe we do a different cost analysis for what we are willing to pay out or what we approve?
Well, there are different provisions of state law that apply for public officials, in terms of what they may be entitled to as far as reimbursement for legal expenses. Then there are legal expenses that agencies incur as well. And you have some cases where the Attorney General's office is involved with defending an agency where there's a suit, or if the Attorney General recuses, then they're entitled to outside counsel. So there's not one, statute that governs all of this. And we do have a role in looking at reasonableness of some of the charges, but there are limitations. Our role is not one to replace the judgment of the attorneys that are representing agencies or officials. So we could question reasonableness, but at the end of the day, unless the legislature wants to put more guardrails or limitations on what could be reimbursed, I think we're somewhat constrained in how much we could limit the money that is paid out in this area. I know, in this case, these cases rather, involving the former governor, are kind of an outlier. We usually don't have these kinds of magnitude of dollars being spent. And I know a lot of people are concerned about that. And I know some of the legislators are proposing changes, with how that's managed. But in fairness to state employees who are not former governors, who may end up in some of these situations, I think we have to be mindful of any changes in statute in terms of what people are entitled to in terms of a defense, that we not just legislate based on the former governor's situation, but keep in mind that there are other people that sometimes get caught up in these situations. So,
But it sounds like what you're saying, though, in the uniqueness of the governor's situation, Governor Cuomo's situation, that reasonableness is a good enough standard to use here to say, this is no longer reasonable, because we look at the broad scope of history, and tens of millions of dollars is beyond the pale based on what you're looking to use it for, and what might be reasonable for someone else obviously will pass muster, because they're not going to be asking for the same type of reimbursements.
Well, you've had a multiplicity of cases. I mean, the way the law is set up, there's not a dollar threshold. Maybe that's one thing you could do. You could say, the state will reimburse up to X amount, but I don't know that we're in a position to arbitrarily set that number.
So I want to turn to some political questions now.
Politics in the state capitol? I can't believe you would raise such a topic.
So a Politico interview and look at you, I think back in 2024, noted that you'd have to run in 2026 and 2030 to make you the longest serving comptroller in the state's history. Is that record meaningful to you?
Is that record meaningful to me?
Because we can see it. 2030 is not that far away now.
It's over the horizon. So I've always, whether I was running for a school board or for state legislature or for controller, I take it one term at a time. So I have decided a long time ago to run for re-election in 2026. I don't presume anything about the term after that, though. I love what I'm doing. I think we do it well. I think it's a critical time in politics in our state and our nation, not a time to walk away. I think particularly for the Comptroller's office, stability is important, consistency is important. So my focus would be just on 2026. If you tell me that the future is that my record will be the second longest serving controller in state history, that's not a bad record right there. Dear Arthur Levitt will always be, I think, in the modern era, the kind of the gold standard for controllers. I don't have any personal, I got to beat Arthur Levitt's record. Because, it's interesting the way your calculation is correct, but it's only because I started this position as an appointment, and that appointment happened on February 7th. So at the end of my next term, I'm going to predict I'll be reelected.
I think that's a safe bet.
I would be.
If someone's taking action on that,
I'm going to hold
I'll make
you to
that
it.
bet
I'm going
right
to hold
now.
you to it.
Yeah.
I would be 5 weeks short of Arthur Levitt's record. So, is it worth it to run in 2030? I don't know. I think some people may be cringing, but they say, another DiNapoli campaign. No, I'm focused on 2026 and getting through the next 4 years after that. Ask me in 2028 what I'm thinking about 2030.
I want to come back, though, to this point you made about this idea of stability, and it makes me think of, and I say this with all due respect, we have at the national level aging leaders. Our president is about 80 years old. We had Mitch McConnell, who was leading the Senate Republicans until very recently, getting up there. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, most notably President Biden was in his early 80s when he was still planning to run for re-election. And I'm curious, how do you balance the institutional knowledge, the stability, as you put it, of those older leaders, and you're going to be, 72 when you're running for re-election next year, versus the idea of fostering a next generation of leaders? And is that even the responsibility of those incumbents? Is it their responsibility to foster that next generation? Should the voters just simply say, yeah, hi, it's time to turn to these people, and if you're going to run as a young person, we'll vote for you?
Right.
How do you think about all that? And remember, I said with all due respect.
Yes, but you had a twinkle in your eye. Your listeners couldn't see that. I could. No, I think partially it depends on the position. I think in many ways. I'll start with my position. My position is in many ways more administrative than policy. So I think the consistency and the stability, especially given Albany and everybody coming and going as governors, lieutenant governors, attorney general. Look at all the people coming and going. Yeah. But somebody's got to keep the lights on and pay the bills and process the contracts and the payroll and the pension. So I think stability has been a plus as far as the controller job. I think with some of the other jobs, it's a fair question. And remember, I started as an 18-year-old, running. So I'm all for next generation. But I think that's up to the public ultimately to decide. You mentioned some prominent people. I think a couple of thoughts I would have, Dave, is first of all, being 70 or 60 is not what it was 30, 40 years ago. I think longevity, health, and so on are very different today than it was years ago. I think you have to evaluate people, and we all age differently as well. Some people are old, at 55, and some people are very spry at 85. Just walking over here, I met a teacher who's still teaching. I forgot how old she said she was, but she's the longest-serving teacher, NYSET member in the state of New York. Senator Hitchie brought her around. I think she was well into her 80s at the very least. She's still teaching.
State Senator Robert Jackson's in his 70s and still plays basketball with the 20-somethings.
And even in terms of the names of people who in recent history has probably galvanized young voters more than just about anybody, Bernie Sanders.
Right.
Bernie Sanders is probably older than a lot of the names that you mentioned before.
Yes.
So I don't think age in and of itself is the determination. I think it's the kind of mental condition you're in, physical condition you're in, and whether or not what you are speaking to resonates with voters, be they young voters or or older voters. So I think it's hard to just categorize everything. Look, I've never been a fan of term limits as an example. Because I think some would argue, to your point, the only way to ensure there is an appropriate turnover and new people and often younger people coming in is term limits. I think term limits deprives the public of a choice.
Yeah. We have term limits. It's when voters vote.
Absolutely. And I think some of the places where you have arbitrary term limits, the turnover happens too fast, and you don't have the kind of institutional knowledge, even more so. I can understand it more for executive position. Certainly president. I don't advocate for
New York governors.
Well,
I mostly just said that for a laugh. But okay.
Pataki was the last one that was 3 terms, right?
That served out all 3 terms.
That served out 3 terms. So it doesn't happen that often. For executives tend to burn out.
Mm-hmm.
When I walk in the assembly now, I don't know very many people, very few people.
Who are all those kids over
Who are all
there?
those
I don't
kids?
know.
I was once one of them, but there's been a huge. I mean, I've been out of there 18 years, but there's been easily a 75-80% turnover. So this notion that the same people are there forever, it just isn't true. Are there some years where there seems to be more incumbents reelected? Sure, but I think there's a bigger turnover than people appreciate. Look, at the national level, I don't fault. I think Nancy Pelosi made a judgment that she wanted to be an elder stateswoman, and certainly for us in New York to have Hakeem Jeffries now as the speaker in waiting, I'll call him. That's not a bad thing at all. But she still has a lot of influence. So I would not be arbitrary. I think the more people running, and I'll trust that most of the time the public is going to make the right choice as to whether someone is up to the job first and foremost, and whatever the age, the person is the right person for that moment.
So you mentioned you're planning on running for comptroller in 2026. So who are you backing for governor in 2026?
Well, as far as I know at this point, the only candidate on the Democratic side is Kathy Hochul, so I expect her to be leading the ticket.
Does that mean you're supporting her for that job?
She hasn't asked me for her support, but I've always been a team player as far as the state ticket, whoever the governor candidate has been.
We could role play it. Hey, Tom, it's me, Kathy.
Well,
I need your support. I'm waiting to announce until I know I've got you locked up.
You don't play Kathy very well. I do have to say that. No, look, there's a lot of speculation as to what's going to happen next year, whether there'll be a primary or not. And I'm sure at the right time we'll all have that conversation. But at this point where we're sitting today, I think Kathy Hochul will be our candidate for governor. Tish James will be our candidate for attorney general. Tom DiNapoli will be our candidate for state controller. And I don't know who the candidate for lieutenant governor is going to be.
Any suggestion on who the governor should pick? Because at one point, you were considering being an LG.
I set up a committee, and I was out there, and Elliot Spitzer made a different choice.
Yeah, I was going to say for listeners,
God bless
this is
David
a
Patterson.
long time ago. This is 20 years ago now.
Yeah, nobody remembers. I actually came across, I had some bumper stickers that I had just had them made for, I should get one of those you can hang up in here, DiNapoli for lieutenant governor. Everybody will say, when did that ever happen? No, I have no recommendation. Look, the lieutenant governor, we have an odd system in New York. We should probably talk about changing that at some point, where you run separate from the governor in the primary, if there is a primary, and you run as a team in the general. It's created some strange political marriages that haven't always worked out.
Palladino Edwards in 2010.
Oh, Cuomo Del Bello in 82. Carrie Krupsak in 74.
All right, now you're just showing off.
Well, sorry. So I don't have any recommendations, but the role of lieutenant governor is an important one, and we've seen in the recent history 2 lieutenant governors have moved up to governor based on circumstances. So it's not a position to be taken lightly, whoever that would be.
Well, we've been speaking with State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli. Comptroller DiNapoli, thanks for visiting us in the studio. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you, Dave. I hope we can do it again soon. And I like it better when we're in studio. But I got to get, your listeners don't see all the posters you have here. I got to get you an updated DiNapoli poster.
No, I wanted DiNapoli for LG bumper sticker.
We got to get a DiNapoli for LG bumper sticker. All right, we'll get one of those. But that may create rumors that I'm not running for controller and instead I'm running for lieutenant governor. That would be mischievous on your part.
I'm also trying to get a John King for governor sign from his time back in Maryland.
Oh, in Maryland, yeah.
We'll see if he has that in his garage somewhere.
Well, we all have some of those campaigns where we'd rather forget that we ran for that. So I should really get you a DiNapoli for North Hempstead Town Council 1975 poster. That would make your day.
And before we turn things over to our conversation with Albany Law School's Richard Rifkin, I want to mention that this week's Dispatches is made possible with support from New York Association on Independent Living, New York State United Teachers, Independent Power Producers of New York, National Fuel, and the American Heart Association. And now we're going to hear from Richard Rifkin, and we're going to pick up with our discussion about the narrowness of the court's opinion on the validity of COELIG. Well, I want to follow up on the point you just made, this idea of a narrow ruling, because I've been covering the Capitol as a reporter for a couple of years now. I don't want to date myself, and there are many times where the legislature and the governor will want to set up some sort of commission, panel, blue ribbon, whatever, and part of the conversation will be the makeup of those appointees? Who's going to have the power? And the governor will traditionally twist their arms and say, I'm going to have a majority of these appointees. I love that first bill you passed, but we're going to do some chapter amendments and we're going to shake up the composition. And as an observer, I always saw that as the governor simply trying to exert his will over whatever outcome there was going to be. Now, though, should I view those past legal maneuverings, that legislative maneuvering, as a effort to uphold the state constitution? And based on this ruling, if there are other commissions that have some sort of implementation responsibility, can they now have a different makeup that the executive maybe doesn't control? Does this ruling extend to those commissions now or in the future?
Well, if you take Judge Rivera's language, it says the decision is narrow and it is limited to the unique problem of self-regulation and enforcement of the ethics and lobbying laws. What she seems to be saying here, if you try to put this into the simple English language,
good luck,
is that we accept this as being constitutional, but only in the area of ethics and lobbying laws. And it would not apply to other departments. For instance, if you take the Department of Health, which obviously enforces the laws related to health, it would appear she would not apply the same standard to that department as she does to the Ethics Commission.
Yeah, although when we're talking about health, we're talking about public health and safety. So if there's some sort of commission responsible for public health, you would hope that they would view that as a sincere and credible issue. But I guess we'd have to have that tested in the courts to determine.
Well, it'll have to be tested in the courts for sure. But the difference, I think, is that the Ethics Commission has the power to investigate and penalize people in that branch of government, the executive branch, whereas the health department basically enforces the law against entities outside of government.
If the former governor's lawsuit had been successful at the State Court of Appeals, what would that have meant for the commission? Would they have had to simply close up shop, or would it just have neutered their oversight powers?
Well, obviously we don't know for sure because that's not what happened. But the Ethics Commission powers are much broader than just enforcement. For instance, they issue opinions to advise officers and employees as to whether a particular act is within or without the ethics laws. As a matter of fact, Cuomo began writing the book by asking for an opinion. Mm-hmm. And he says, may I write this book while I'm governor? It's about what I did as governor during the pandemic, and then keep the proceeds personally. And the commission basically said, yes, you can do this, but you can't use government employees to assist you in writing the book. But that's very typical. You have a situation, if somebody comes and makes the offer of a gift, for instance, to any officer or employee of the state, the standards for when you can accept a gift are somewhat vague. And they can write to the commission and say, may I or may not accept this gift? And you can get an opinion from the commission. So that's one function of the commission. The commission also educates, and everyone is required to take a course that's given by the commission. You get it online. And so they have an educational function. So they have much broader functions than just penalizing people. What would have happened if the court had found it unconstitutional? One of the questions would be, are they finding unconstitutional only the enforcement piece, or are they finding the whole commission unconstitutional? And that would have been one of the questions the court would have had to have dealt with. One of the questions that I think is interesting is supposing they had declared this commission unconstitutional. What would have been done? And I think in the dissenting opinion in the Court of Appeals written by Judge Garcia, he basically said what they should have done here and still could do is amend the Constitution. They shouldn't have done it by statute. They should have done it by a constitutional amendment which would have authorized this particular commission. It's a little more complicated. It has to be passed twice by the legislature, has to be approved by the voters. But he said that would have allowed this to happen. So the question is, could they have accomplished these objectives, which I think everybody agreed were good objectives, but done it in a constitutional manner? I think Judge Garcia answered that question in his dissent.
Yeah, and we're getting this ruling in 2025, so they could have done first passage in 2022, they could have done second passage in 2023, 2024, and we'd have the new system in effect in 2025 without any of these questions hanging over our head. But they definitely chose not to go that route, which is, I guess, their prerogative. But
every time a constitutional amendment is put before the voters, there's always a question of whether the voters are going to approve it or not. I don't know this, but it may be the legislature didn't want to take the risk of going through the process of a constitutional amendment and then possibly having the voters turn it down, which would have left them really in a difficult position.
Or conversely, as Jenny Rivera points out, this would have helped ensure the public confidence and trust in our government as we go out to the people to get their approval of this wonderful new system.
Well, that would have certainly been the argument that would have been made for it should it have gone to the voters.
If I can tap into your past experience as an ethics watchdog, how does the setup of the commission compare to some of its previous incarnations, or the ethics watchdog you had? Is it demonstrably different and have the potential to be demonstrably more effective than previous entities?
We are now on our fourth ethics commission. I was the executive director of the first commission, which was established in 1987. We did not do very much enforcement. I had 3 investigators, and we had 250,000 people under our jurisdiction. 3 investigators wasn't going to get you very far in terms of enforcement. But at that point, we were new. Never been an ethics commission before us. And we spent most of our time and effort putting out opinions to help guide those subject to the ethics laws to explain how they work. That was really the main focus of our opinion. So we had very little in the way of enforcement. They kept changing the commission. This starts to get a little bit technical. What happened was, in our commission, we had no jurisdiction whatsoever over the legislature and legislative employees. And the reason was, the legislature said, you can't because of separation of powers. So they set up a separate legislative ethics commission.
Which still exists.
Yeah, although it made life a little interesting because I still remember this very well. In those days, this is not the law anymore, an employee could not accept a gift of more than $75 when the person giving the gift had a matter before his or her agency, or in the case of the legislature, before the legislature. So we put out an opinion saying that $75 means $75 within 1 year. So it's a yearly limit of $75. The Legislative Ethics Commission said, oh no, each gift so that if a lobbyist took a legislator to dinner and paid $70 one night, the lobbyist can do the same thing the next week. So we were off to some degree on different levels, but the legislature would not agree at that point to include themselves in the bill, and the bill that was passed setting up the first commission basically had two totally separate commissions. More and more, the legislature started, at least in part, to come under the role of the commission. In addition, at that time, there was a separate commission on lobbying. That commission got folded into some of the future commissions. And each commission that was created, various problems were found as they implemented the law. And so they kept creating new commissions. And I say this is the fourth one. And if the court had gone the other way, we would have been on our fifth one. For instance, now there still is a legislative ethics commission. The state commission that we've been talking about has the power to investigate legislators. But if they believe a violation has occurred, they do not have the power to enforce against legislators. Rather, they have to give the matter to the Legislative Ethics Commission, and that commission enforces against legislators. The problem is each commission has had its problems, and each time the legislature has tried to revamp the commission to help it resolve those problems, also being well aware of separation of powers.
When you think about the work of these commissions through the years, how much of their effectiveness is a product of their underlying authority, and how much of it do you think is a product of who's empowered at these commissions? Because I think about the last 20 years, and there have been some cowboys like David Grandow, and then there have been the revamping of these entities like we have now with COELIG, where they're supposedly empowered more, but maybe they're not necessarily taking as much of a high profile stance. How do you think about the balance between their powers and who's wielding the powers in terms of their effectiveness?
It's very hard to say. What we do know is that they, in many cases, have not been very effective with enforcement. In part, it may be their closeness to the governor. In part, it may be lack of funding. In part, it may be weaknesses in the law, or maybe a combination of all three. But what happened over the years, as the listeners may remember, is that most of the ethics enforcement was carried out by the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Preet Bharara.
Yeah, with the ethics watchdog usually following a few years behind and saying, we do have some concerns about that Shelley Silver or Dean Skelos. The ethics watchdog was never the one leading the way.
Right, you're right. I mean, clearly, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District became the leading prosecutor, if you will, of ethics violations by state officials.
I'm curious about your own experience at the Ethics Commission in the mid-'90s, and what was that like? Did you have people in your ear at the time, or because of the limited powers you had, were people not that concerned with what Richard was getting up to?
Well, we had limited powers, and I said a very limited budget with 3 investigators. So we had a couple of relatively small enforcement matters, but none that ever rose to the occasion of a high-level official who really had power and authority.
Well, we've been speaking with Richard Rifkin. He is the legal director for the Government Law Center at Albany Law School, and in another life served as executive director of the State Ethics Commission. Richard, thanks for visiting us in the studio. I really appreciate it.
Glad to have done it.
And that's our show. If you want to hear more from Comptroller DiNapoli or Richard Rifkin, look up their appearances on the Capitol Press Room, which you can find at capitolpressroom.org or wherever you get podcasts. And if you enjoyed this program, please leave us a rating and review wherever you download the show. Until next time, podcast adjourned.